Hello, my loyal royal friends and subjects. I have another tale to share with you. Today's episode starts Season 2, and since I wanted to pick a really good story to start off this season, I figured I would start off with the good old Brothers Grimm, with the tale of Rumpelstiltskin. Thanks to pop culture, specifically the television show Once Upon a Time, as well as the Shrek film franchise, I feel like a lot of us might already know what kind of character Rumpelstiltskin is. He seems to thrive on making deals, promising his victims their greatest desires while having them pay a price for it. As he said in Once Upon a Time, magic has a price. Dearie. Did he say dearie at the end? I don't know. He said dearie a lot in the show. However, it's been a while since the show ended and Shrek Forever After was released. At the time, this fairy tale character was very popular, as shown by all the fan art. Seriously, how many times could someone draw Robert Carlyle with a six-pack? Yet, despite his popularity, do many people today know his story? What about his association with making deals or even the importance of his name? It's actually one of my favorite stories by the Brothers Grimm. And I'm genuinely surprised that Disney has not yet turned this fairy tale into an animated film, especially considering the character's popularity in Once Upon a Time. You'd think they'd get on board with that. Well, I remember asking the same question about Rapunzel, and we ended up with Tangled, so maybe there's still hope. Nevertheless, today I'm here to share the story regardless of whether any of you listening are familiar with it or not. It's definitely a tale worth sharing. As always, before we read the story, let's go ahead and discuss Rumpelstiltskin's origins. According to the Arne Thompson Uther Index for Folktales, Rumpelstiltskin's tale type is ATU 500, known as the Name of the Helper. In order to look up the history of this tale, I decided to turn to Fairy Tale in the Ancient World by Graham Anderson. At first glance, this story doesn't seem to have been cited before the Renaissance. But according to Anderson, traces of this tale can be found in ancient Greco-Roman and Egyptian mythology. For example, there is a passage from Dionysius of Halicarnassus's Roman Antiquities that reads, Chryse, the daughter of Pallas, when she was married to Dardanus, brought for her dowry the gifts of Athena, that is, the Pallidea, and the sacred symbols of the great gods, in whose mysteries she had been instructed. When the Arcadians, fleeing from the deluge, left the Peloponnesus and established their abode in the Thracian island, Dardanus built there a temple to these gods, whose particular names he kept secret from all any others, and performed the mysteries in their honor, which are observed to this day by the Samothracians. There's also the Egyptian myth about the goddess Isis, who poisons the sun god Ra in order to find out his true name, so that she may not only heal him, but also become more powerful just by knowing his true name. You may notice that both of these tales from the ancient world contain themes of a secret name, and as you'll soon see, learning a secret name becomes very important in the story of Rumpelstiltskin. According to Heidi Ann Heiner on SarahLaloon.com, one of my favorite websites by the way, the first literary version of the tale comes from Johann Fischart's adaptation of Book 1, of Francois Rabelais's Gargantua and Pantagruel, which was published in 1575 to 1590. For the most part, the story has been known throughout most of Europe, but of course, the most famous version of this story is by the Brothers Grimm, who collected 4 versions of this story, the story that we shall be reading today. Now, with that out of the way, I invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of Rumpelstiltskin by the Brothers Grimm. There was once upon a time a poor miller who had a very beautiful daughter. Now it happened one day that he had an audience with the king, and in order to appear a person of some importance, he told him that he had a daughter who could spin straw into gold. Now that's a talent worth having, said the king to the miller. If your daughter is as clever as you say, bring her to my palace tomorrow, and I'll put her to the test. When the girl was brought to him, he led her into a room full of straw, gave her a spinning wheel and spindle, and said, Now set to work and spin all night till early dawn. And if by that time you haven't spun the straw into gold, you shall die. Then he closed the door behind him and left her alone inside. Hey, Miller Dad, next time you want to bet someone's life, bet your own by saying that you can spin straw into gold and leave your daughter out of your mess. The fact that he's never mentioned again in this story leads me to believe that she went no contact with him. I can't say I blame her. What is it with fairy tale parents getting their children into dangerous situations? Funny enough, there are other versions of the tale in which the maiden must spin flax into yarn, but she can only spin it into golden thread. This saddens her for some reason. I guess she really needed normal yarn. Yeah, I have this superpower to literally make myself rich, but what use is that to me? So the poor miller's daughter sat down and didn't know what in the world she was to do. She hadn't the least idea of how to spin straw into gold, and became at last so miserable that she began to cry. Suddenly the door opened, and in stepped a tiny little man and said, "Good evening, Miss Millermaid. Why are you crying so bitterly?" "Oh," answered the girl, "I have to spin straw into gold, and I haven't a notion how it's done." "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" asked the mannequin. "My necklace," replied the girl. The little man took the necklace, sat himself down at the wheel, and whir, 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 the wheel went round 3 times, and the bobbin was full. Then he put on another, and whir, 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 the wheel went round 3 times, and the second too was full. And so it went on till morning, when all the straw was spun away, and all the bobbins were full of gold. As soon as the sun rose, the king came, and when he perceived the gold, he was astonished and delighted. But his heart only lusted more than ever after the precious metal. He had the miller's daughter put into another room full of straw, much bigger than the first, and bade her, if she valued her life, spin it all into gold before the following morning. The girl didn't know what to do, and began to cry. Then the door opened as before, and the tiny little man appeared and said, "What'll you give me if I spin the straw into gold for you?" "The ring from my finger," answered the girl. The mannequin took the ring, and whir, round went the spinning wheel again, and when morning broke he had spun all the straw into glittering gold. I noticed that in some modern adaptations, the necklace and ring usually have some sentimental value attached to them. Usually they're supposed to be her only dowry, or that they belong to a loved one, like her dead mother. This is one of my favorite modern-day changes to this story, because it feels like the price gets higher as she needs him to spend more gold. And as we're about to see, he's going to be asking her for something far more valuable than those trinkets. The king was pleased beyond measure at the sights, but his greed for gold was still not satisfied, and he had the miller's daughter brought into a yet bigger room full of straw, and said, "You must spin all this away in the night. But if you succeed this time, you shall become my wife. She's only a miller's daughter, it's true," he thought, "but I couldn't find a richer wife if I were to search the whole world over." When the girl was alone, the little man appeared for the 3rd time, and said, "What'll you give me if I spin the straw for you once again?" "I've nothing more to give," answered the girl. "Then promise me, when you are queen, to give me your first child." "Who knows what may not happen before that," thought the miller's daughter, and besides, she saw no other way out of it. So she promised the mannequin what he demanded, and he set to work once more and spun the straw into gold. All right, before anyone starts accusing the miller's daughter of being a worse parent than her father, I would like to rush to her defense. She's been through a lot, so I got you, girl. First of all, she clearly feels as if she has no choice, and isn't even sure if she'll ever have a child to give him in the first place. I don't know about you, but I normally don't consider the well-being of my hypothetical future children when I'm in a situation in which I'm wondering if I'll live long enough to have any. So yeah, cut her some slack, and maybe instead of blaming her for acting out of desperation and uncertainty, you should be blaming her mysterious helper for manipulating her into making that promise. Speaking of whom, you'll notice that he has been referred to as a mannequin. No, he is not a giant doll that models clothing at the store. Rather, the word refers to a small person. In this case, he is not a small human being, but as you can see, he is part of the supernatural world, like fairy folk, which are usually described as small beings. He's also referred to as a dwarf in other versions of the story, and a devil in others. Personally, I think he's an imp, which is a mischievous demon or sprite. Another interesting thing is that in other versions of ATU 500, instead of the unborn child, it's the maiden herself that the helper wants, either in marriage or, if he's a devil, he'll want her soul as payment. I'm genuinely surprised to find out that saving herself is mostly the case in this tale type, rather than promising the unborn child. Honestly, I feel like Disney would take that approach, if they ever turn Rumpelstiltskin into a movie. It just feels like the more family-friendly option. Before we continue, there's one more thing that I found interesting. If you've ever watched Once Upon a Time, you might be familiar with the episode called The Price of Gold. In this episode, instead of the fairy godmother, it's Rumpelstiltskin who sends Cinderella to the ball, in exchange for her firstborn child. You might be interested to hear that when I read Heiner's book, Cinderella Tales from Around the World, I came upon a tale called Whip in the Ashes, a story from Denmark. It's your basic Cinderella story in which our poor heroine is worked by her wicked stepmother, except each time her magical helper gives her beautiful clothes to wear to church, she promises one of her unborn children. The reason why she's so eager to make this promise is because she doesn't believe that she'll ever get married and have children and says that she'll probably work for her evil mother for the rest of her life. However, she eventually meets the prince at church, and they get married and have children. I just thought that was a neat story to come across that reminded me of that episode of Once Upon a Time. When the king came in the morning and found everything as he had desired, he straightway made her his wife, and the miller's daughter became a queen. Another one of my favorite modern changes made to this story is that the king and miller's daughter fall in love with each other. In some cases, he's making her spin so much straw into gold to save his kingdom from bankruptcy. Or, if his intentions are out of greed, he eventually learns that love is more precious than gold. On another account, he's actually a prince, and his greedy father is the one who makes the miller's daughter spin, while his son falls in love with her and could care less about riches. Regardless of how he's portrayed in modern times, in this story, the king only values the miller's daughter for her ability to make him rich, or rather for the ability he thinks she has, instead of seeing her as a human being. This makes me glad that storytelling and feminism have come a long way to show that this is not an okay view to have on women, which is most likely why so many changes have been made to the king, to make him more likable and understanding and seeing the miller's daughter as an equal rather than a magical money machine. When a year had passed, a beautiful son was born, and she thought no more of the little man, till all of a sudden, one day, he stepped into her room and said, "Now give me what you promised." The queen was in a great state and offered the little man all the riches in her kingdom if he would only leave her the child. But the mannequin said, "No! A living creature is dearer to me than all the treasures of the world." Then the queen began to cry and sob so bitterly that the little man was sorry for her and said, "I'll give you 3 days to guess my name, and if you find out in that time, you may keep your child." So this guy spun straw into gold 3 times for the miller's daughter, and now she's given 3 days to guess his name. Gotta love that rule of 3 in fairy tales. Then the queen pondered the whole night over all the names she had ever heard, and sent a messenger to scour the land and to pick up far and near any names he could come across. When the little man arrived on the following day, she began with Casper, Melchior, Belshazzar, and all the other names she knew, in a string, but at each one the mannequin called out, "That's not my name!" The next day she sent to inquire the names of all the people in the neighborhood, and had a long list of the most uncommon and extraordinary for the little man when he made his appearance. "Is your name, perhaps, Sheepshanks, Crookshanks, Spindleshanks?" But he always replied, "That's not my name!" On the 3rd day the messenger returned and announced, "I have not been able to find any new names, But as I came upon a high hill round the corner of the wood, where the foxes and hares bid each other good night, I saw a little house, and in front of the house burned a fire, and round the fire sprang the most grotesque little man, hopping on one leg and crying, "Tomorrow I brew, today I bake, and then the child away I'll take. For little deems my royal dame that Rumpelstiltskin is my name." Well, now we know the name, although you might have guessed it just by reading the title of this story. Don't ask me what Rumpelstiltskin means. Scholars seem to debate the origin of that name. In other versions of the tale, a female friend is the one who overhears this name. Otherwise, it's the king who overhears this. Although in this case, he's disappeared from this story, which is fine by me. I didn't really like him. Remember when I mentioned that Graham Anderson found traces of this story in Roman antiquities? Well, in the passage I read near the beginning of this episode, there was a reference to the Megalai-Theo mysteries, who kept the names of their great gods a secret. It is also implied that they practiced wild dancing that would include leaping and stamping, similar to how Rumpelstiltskin was hopping around the fire and chanting his name. I can see how this dance could be interpreted as some kind of demonic ritual, especially when the helper is a literal devil in other versions of the story. You may imagine the queen's delight at hearing the name. And when the little man stepped in shortly afterward and asked, "Now, my lady queen, what's my name?" she asked first, "Is your name Conrad?" "No." "Is your name Harry?" "No." "Is your name perhaps Rumpelstiltskin?" "Some demon has told you that! Some demon has told you that!" screamed the little man, and in his rage drove his right foot so far into the ground that it sank in up to his waist. Then, in a passion, he seized the left foot with both hands and tore himself in two. The end! I know, that's a pretty abrupt ending. Most fairy tales seem to end with mentioning the villain's demise instead of the typical, "and they lived happily ever after" bit. Anyway, that was the story of Rumpelstiltskin. I noticed that the way he stamped his foot into the floor is probably another reference to the stamping of the Megalai-Theo mysteries. I read in Heiner's annotations of this story that apparently there are critics who condemn the queen for her actions at the end of the story, most likely for guessing the wrong names on purpose, just to mess with Rumpelstiltskin. For example, one critic, Roger Sale, says that the queen is cruel to the only person in the entire story who helped her and showed her any compassion. To that I say, did Sale and I read the same story? Rumpelstiltskin has never shown any genuine kindness to our leading lady here. Sure, he helped save her life, but not out of the goodness of his heart. He straight up manipulated her into giving him her future child when she was in a very vulnerable and life-threatening position. How is that an act of compassion? And no, giving her a chance to win her baby back doesn't count as kindness either, because he was clearly expecting her to fail. Thankfully, Heiner and I seem to share the same opinion on the matter. This queen has taken so much mistreatment from pretty much everyone else in this story. Her father lied and got her into this mess in the first place. Her husband threatened her life and married her for riches. Let's hope he never asks her to spin straw into gold ever again, because obviously she won't be able to do it. Finally, the person who saved her life demanded her child as payment. Aside from the messenger who gave her the name, literally nobody offered her genuine help in this story. For once, at the end, she had the upper hand over one of her tormentors, and I'm glad that she messed with him. Make him feel like victory is at hand, only to take him down. Now, one question that many of us might ask is, what did Rumpelstiltskin want with the queen's baby? Does he want his own child, like the sorceress and Rapunzel? Based on what he was chanting about brewing and baking, does he want to eat the child? If he's a dwarf, does he have a fascination with children like most of the Fae folk? If he's a demon, then does he want the innocent baby's soul? Even if the answer is yes to any of these, why does he want the queen's baby specifically? Does he prefer royal blood, or does he wish to throw the kingdom into ruin by ridding it of the firstborn son and heir? In the end, he never wins the baby, so I guess we are only left to speculate. There is a moral that I have personally interpreted in this story, and it goes back to what Rumpelstiltskin said earlier, that something alive is much more precious than riches. This whole mess started with gold and greed. Yet what are all the treasures in the world without someone to love? I hope that Rumpelstiltskin can teach us not to take advantage of our loved ones, and focus more on the important things, besides riches. You know what? I realize that Rumpelstiltskin is too short for an episode, so let's go ahead and read a bonus story. This one is also by the Brothers Grimm, and it's called The Three Spinners. While this story bears many similarities to Rumpelstiltskin, it's not part of ATU 500, but rather ATU 501. I know, just one number off. This tale type is known as the Three Old Spinning Helpers. The Grimm Bros collected multiple variants of this story from different sources. This tale has also been popular with its variants throughout Europe, but let's go ahead and read the Brothers Grimm's version, The Three Spinners. There was once a girl who was idle and would not spin, and let her mother say what she would, she could not bring her to it. At last the mother was once so overcome with anger and impatience that she beat her, on which the girl began to weep loudly. Now at this very moment the queen drove by, and when she heard the weeping, she stopped her carriage, went into the house, and asked the mother why she was beating her daughter so that the cries could be heard out on the road. Then the woman was ashamed to reveal the laziness of her daughter, and said, "I cannot get her to leave off spinning. She insists on spinning forever and ever, and I am poor, and cannot procure the flax." Then answered the queen, "There is nothing that I like better to hear than spinning, and I am never happier than when the wheels are humming. Let me have your daughter with me in the palace. I have flax enough, and there she shall spin as much as she likes." The mother was heartily satisfied with this, and the queen took the girl with her. Two things. Number one, I guess the queen is really into spinning ASMR. And two, once again, a parent lies to royalty and gets their child in a bad spinning predicament. Although in this case, the mother lies out of embarrassment rather than out of pure boasting. By the way, I can't say that I sympathize with our heroine here. She's not very likable since she's too lazy to work. Look, I don't like to work either, but you know what? I do it anyway because that's the responsible thing to do. Although seriously, adulting sucks. The miller's daughter from Rumpelstiltskin did nothing to deserve the mess that her father got her into. But if the daughter in this story just listened to her mother and helped around the house, then she wouldn't have gotten herself into this mess. Well, she is the main character, so let's go ahead and see how she gets herself out of this situation. When they had arrived at the palace, she led her up into 3 rooms which were filled from bottom to the top with the finest flax. "Now spin me this flax," said she, "and when thou hast done it, thou shalt have my eldest son for a husband, even if thou art poor. I care not for that. Thy indefatigable industry is dowry enough." That's rather interesting, since you would think that, like the king from Rumpelstiltskin, the queen would care more about riches, especially when it comes to having her son marry her. Rather, she is so fascinated with spinning, either because of the ASMR or the admiration of the maiden's hard-working nature, which, unbeknownst to the queen, is non-existent. This fascination clearly outweighs any riches that our so-called heroine is unable to provide, and I just find this so interesting. The girl was secretly terrified, for she could not have spun the flax. No, not if she had lived till she was 300 years old, and had sat at it every day from morning till night. When therefore she was alone, she began to weep, and sat thus for 3 days without moving a finger. Couldn't she at least try to spin? In the case of the miller's daughter, spinning straw into gold is an impossible task, but the girl in this story isn't exactly expected to perform a miracle. Even if she fails at the task, the least she could do is try. Maybe if she hadn't been a brat in the first place, she could have learned how to spin from her mother. On the 3rd day came the queen, and when she saw that nothing had been spun yet, she was surprised. But the girl excused herself by saying that she had not been able to begin because of her great distress at leaving her mother's house. The queen was satisfied with this, but said when she was going away, "Tomorrow, thou must begin to work." When the girl was alone again, she did not know what to do, and in her distress went to the window. Then she saw 3 women coming towards her, the first of whom had a broad flat foot. The second had such a great underlip that it hung down over her chin, and the third had a broad thumb. They remained standing before the window, looked up, and asked the girl what was amiss with her. She complained of her trouble, and then they offered her their help and said, "If thou wilt invite us to the wedding, not be ashamed of us, and wilt call us thine aunts, and likewise wilt place us at thy table, we will spin up the flax for thee, and that in a very short time." "With all my heart," she replied. "Do but come in and begin the work at once." Then she let in the 3 strange women, and cleared a place in the first room, where they seated themselves and began their spinning. The one drew the thread and trod the wheel, the other wetted the thread, the third twisted it, and struck the table with her finger, and as often as she struck it, a skein of thread fell to the ground that was spun in the finest manner possible. The girl concealed the 3 spinners from the queen, and showed her whenever she came the great quantity of spun thread, until the latter could not praise her enough. When the first room was empty, she went to the second, and at last to the third, and that too was quickly cleared. Then the 3 women took leave and said to the girl, "Do not forget what thou hast promised us. It will make thy fortune." I wonder if these 3 women are inspired by the Fates, or rather the Moirai, from Greek mythology, or the Norns from Norse mythology. Both groups consist of 3 women who spun threads of life and lay out the destinies of everyone, including the gods. The 3 women here even predict that if the girl invites them to their wedding, then it will bring her good fortune. I would be very surprised if these 3 women were not inspired by the Fates and the Norns. When the maiden showed the queen the empty rooms and the great heap of yarn, she gave orders for the wedding, and the bridegroom rejoiced that he was to have such a clever and industrious wife, and praised her mightily. "Wow, this prince is already 10 times better than the greedy king who only married the miller's daughter for a money-making talent that she doesn't really have. Instead, the prince here admires his future bride for how clever and hard-working she is. Unfortunately, she's neither of those things, so too bad for him." "I have 3 aunts," said the girl, "and as they have been very kind to me, I should not like to forget them in my good fortune. Allow me to invite them to the wedding, and let them sit with us at table." The queen and the bridegroom said, "Why should we not allow that?" Therefore, when the feast began, the 3 women entered in strange apparel, and the bride said, "Welcome, dear aunts." Well, she might be a lazy brat, but at least she keeps her promises. Promises that I would like to add she was not forced to make. "Ugh," said the bridegroom, "how comest thou by these odious friends?" Thereupon he went to the one with the broad flat foot, and said, "How do you come by such a broad foot?" "By treading," she answered, "by treading." Then the bridegroom went to the second, and said, "How do you come by your falling lip?" "By licking," she answered, "by licking." Then he asked the third, "How do you come by your broad thumb?" "By twisting the thread," she answered, "by twisting the thread." On this the king's son was alarmed and said, "Neither now nor ever shall my beautiful bride touch a spinning wheel." And thus she got rid of the hateful flax spinning. The end, I guess. You know what? I take back everything I said earlier about the prince. At first, it seemed as if he liked his bride for who she was, or rather wasn't, as a person, but no, he cares more about her looks. Maybe those 3 spinners should visit the king from Rumpelstiltskin and convince him to never make his wife spin straw into gold again. Nah, he'll probably still care more about riches than her looks. Also, the girl learned nothing and got rewarded for being lazy. I honestly can't stand fairy tales with an unlikable character who gets unjustified happily ever afters. On the contrary, I prefer characters who have gone through so much suffering and rise to power in the end, like Cinderella and, of course, the miller's daughter in Rumpelstiltskin. As you can see, both of these stories are different, especially since they come from different tale types. Yet they also have so much in common. They both have a maiden who is given the task of spinning, a task that is given to someone who the maiden promises something in return. Yet the outcomes of these promises differ, depending on the risk. One must be broken while the other is kept. While I can't possibly fathom what the moral of the three spinners is supposed to be, I do believe there are a few lessons that we can learn from both of these stories. Lesson 1. Be honest and never lie. Lying could get you or your loved ones into danger. Lesson 2. There are more important things than riches, like love and a person's worth for who they are. Finally, Lesson 3. Promises can be a powerful thing. They must be kept, yet there are times when we are unable to do that. It is up to us to decide what is right for us and our loved ones and determine the risk that we take when making promises. You never know which promises will lead us to fortune or to peril. I really hope you enjoyed today's stories. Please follow for more fairy tales. Until next time, my friends, may all your dreams come true and fare thee well. Mwah!